Welcome, everyone. In this explainer, we're going to break down some of the most important Islamic principles around female purity. We'll be walking through a guide to make it all clear and simple, so let's dive right in.
Assalamu alaikum. We're going to start with this quote because it perfectly sets the stage for our discussion. Our focus is on three key areas: haid, which is menstruation, the purity interval that occurs between cycles, and nifas, or postpartum bleeding. Understanding the specific timings here is so important, and our goal today is to make it all crystal clear.
All right, so first up, let's dive right into the foundational rules of menstruation, also known as haid. This is really our starting point because the timeframes we establish here will affect everything else we discuss.
Okay, so the very first key number to lock in your mind is 24 hours. For any bleeding to be officially considered haid, it has to last for at least one full day and night. If it's anything less than that, well, that falls into a completely different category.
And that, of course, brings up a really practical question, doesn't it? What happens if the bleeding is very brief and stops before it even hits that 24-hour mark?
Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. It is not considered menstruation. And the most important takeaway here is what she does next. She would resume her prayers and also make up for any that were missed during that short window of time. Okay, so we've got our 24-hour minimum down. Now, while a typical cycle might last somewhere around 6 or 7 days for most, there's also a very strict maximum limit that you need to be aware of, and that's 15 days. This 15-day marker is an absolutely critical rule. You could almost think of it as a hard cutoff point for what qualifies as haid. So that begs the question, what happens if the bleeding doesn't stop? Which leads us right to our next logical question. What is the ruling when bleeding goes on past that 15-day maximum? And this is where we get a really important distinction. Anything up to 15 days is considered haid. But the moment it continues past that mark, it gets a new classification, istihada. This is considered non-menstrual bleeding, and it comes with a completely different set of rules. Okay, so now that we have a handle on the timelines for menstruation itself, let's talk about the time between cycles. This is what we call the purity interval. So what exactly is the purity interval? Well, it's pretty simple, really. It's just that period of non-bleeding that separates one cycle from the next. And just like haid, this interval has its own specific minimum duration. And here's the key number for the purity interval: 15 days. The period of purity between two cycles must be at least 15 days long. This isn't a suggestion, it's a fixed minimum. So that makes you wonder, right? If there's a fixed minimum, does that mean there's a maximum too? Or is it just the minimum that's set in stone? And that's a great question. The answer is, you've got it exactly right. While the minimum is firmly fixed at 15 days, there's actually no upper limit at all on how long a period of purity can last. All right, let's move on to our third and final topic, nifas. Now, this is a very distinct category of bleeding that applies specifically to the period right after childbirth. And right away, we see a huge difference here compared to menstruation. Remember how haid needed a full 24 hours to even count? With nifas, it's totally different. Even a single moment of bleeding after childbirth is enough for the rulings of a nifas to kick in. So when we look at the timeline for nifas, a typical duration is about 40 days. But the absolute maximum limit, the hard stop, is 60 days. This is another one of those key numbers to keep in mind. And just like before, you're probably asking, okay, but what happens if the bleeding goes on for more than 60 days? Well, in that scenario, it stops being considered nifas. And you guessed it, just like with menstruation that goes on for too long, this bleeding would then be treated as istihada and follow those specific rulings instead. All right, that was a lot of numbers and timelines, I know. So let's pull it all together in a quick summary. This will really help visualize everything we've just talked about side by side. Okay, let's walk through this together one last time. For haid or menstruation, remember the 24-hour minimum and the 15-day max. For the purity interval between cycles, it's a 15-day minimum, but remember, no maximum limit. And finally, for nifas, postnatal bleeding, it starts from the very first moment and has that 60-day maximum. You know, this is a great one to grab a screenshot of if you want a quick reference later on. And what better way to wrap this up than with this beautiful sentiment from our source material? May Allah grant us beneficial knowledge. If you found this breakdown helpful, we would love for you to subscribe for more explainers on important topics just like this one. Thank you so much for joining me. Assalamu alaikum.